Hey, welcome back to Tech Tip Tuesday. Today we're going to talk about best practices for dealing with block scaling, either as a complete medallion style quilt, which is what you see here. This is the La Stella pattern by Quilted Studios. Or if you have individual blocks that you're just trying to rescale to make them bigger in order to get kind of that contrast between size or change the scale of the motif for different sizes of quilts. Now, this can be a little bit tricky because sometimes the math can get a little bit difficult to deal with, but we're going to talk about some best practices that will make that process go smoothly for you so that you don't have to fiddle with it too much and you don't end up where you do all of this work trying to rescale it only to realize that one of your dimensions doesn't work and then you've got to restart and do the whole thing again. So let's talk about how you actually accomplish this. And let's say you've got a 12-inch block that you're trying to rescale up to maybe a 15 or 18-inch block. So when you're trying to do that, you always want to start with the smallest size first and then multiply. So if you're doing, a 6, 9, and 12-inch block, you want to start with the 9-inch block, get all of your design finalized, make sure all the dimensions work there, and then multiply up to get the additional sizes. That works much better than starting with a large block and then working backwards to try and make it smaller, because that's when we start to get into these situations where you get wonky dimensions that we don't want. So you always want to try and avoid, as you're doing that, dimensions that are ending in a 1/4 inch or 3/4 of an inch. So try to get all your dimensions in whole inches or half inches. That works best when you start to multiply, because if you do a 1/4 inch or a 3/4 inch multiplied by 1.5 or 2.5 to scale it up in order to get a bigger size, the second you multiply those two numbers together, you're going to end up with an 1/8 inch increment, which is, again, what we were trying to avoid with this whole entire situation, because nobody likes to cut 1/8 inch increments. If you can, it's always going to be best if you use whole multiples, right? If you take any dimension, multiply it by 2, and the original dimension was in a 1/4 inch increment, something you could cut with a quilting ruler, you're going to end up with something you can still cut with a quilting ruler. It's always going to give you a 1/4 inch increment if you multiply by whole numbers. Sometimes you can't do that, right? If you're going from 6-inch block to a 9-inch block, that's a 1.5 multiple. It's just what it is. There's nothing you can do about that. But if you can try to stick to these whole multiples, that will always guarantee that if it worked in the small size, it's going to work in the big size. So if you can, try to use those whole multiples, but if you can't, there are some things that you can still do. Just make sure that the small size doesn't have anything that's ending in a 1/4 inch or a 3/4 inch dimension. And the reason we're doing all of this is to make sure we avoid those 1/8 inch increments. Nobody likes cutting 1/8 inch increments. It's very, very difficult to do on most quilting rulers. They're just not set up for it. If you look at a quilting ruler, right, we've got major lines, which are your inches. Sometimes even the half inches are solid lines that are marked out, but you usually have large markings for your 1/4 inch markings. And then if you have 1/8 inch markings at all, they're usually very, very small. And that makes it difficult to line up on fabric and get dimensions that are ending in 1/8 inch, 3/8 inch, 5/8 inch, things along those lines cut very accurately, because you're dealing with these little tiny markings, and it's just, there's a lot of room for error the smaller those markings are. So anytime you can avoid an 1/8 inch increment in your quilting, do that. And a lot of times when you're rescaling blocks, if you're not careful about where you start and kind of start this in a systematic fashion, it's really, really easy to end up with blocks that have 1/8 inch increments or even 16th inch increments, which is not what we want. So by starting with the smallest size first and then making sure that you have tweaked your design to try and avoid any dimensions that are like 1 1/4, 1 3/4, something along those lines, and you've done your best to keep it to whole multiples to try and scale up from there, you will always guarantee that you've avoided these 1/8 inch increments. Now, there are a couple of shortcuts that we can talk about when you're rescaling block sizes, because there are particular ones that work better based on the grid that your block has when you designed it. And this is really important if you're taking two different blocks that are maybe on different grid scales and you're trying to mesh them together into the same quilt pattern, where you need those blocks to be equivalent sizes in order to be able to sew them together. So if we're talking about a 3x3 grid, which is something like you see up in the top here, we've basically got the block broken into 3 pieces, and some of those are combined, right? But you can still see this is a 3x3 grid. 3x3 grids are always going to work best in 3-inch, 6-inch, 9-inch, right? So multiples of 3. You can do some 1.5 inch increments there. That would give you like a 4.5. That'll work with a 3x3 grid as well. But basically all of these base sizes, these patterns will work with a 3x3 grid. Now, if you're mixing a 3x3 and a 4x4 grid, you're probably going to want to make sure that those blocks are 12 inches. The other option here is 6 inches, but again, that's a really small block. And you can start to mix, right? This is not an exhaustive list at all. Like I said, there is a 4.5 that'll work with a 3x3 grid, but that's when you start to usually get into these like 1.5, 1.25, 1 3/4 inch dimensions, right? Some of those wonky things that don't work very well with rescaling. So it just depends on what you're going for. But kind of keeping that in mind when you're designing the block and setting the scale initially will help save you a lot of work later trying to get everything to fit together if you end up swapping a block out or something along those lines. 5x5 grids are tricky to integrate with other grid types just because of the way that they usually end up. You're usually going to have an increment of 5, 10, 15, and 20. And you'll notice that there are not very many of those numbers repeated in any of these other grid lists. And that makes it very difficult to kind of meld a 5x5 grid with a 3x3 grid or something along those lines. You can do it, but again, we start to get into those wonky dimensions. So these are just things to be aware of as you're designing. And again, most people, this is a no-brainer, right? You usually realize this if you've ever tried to design a 2-block quilt pattern. But the reason I call it out here is because this is a lot easier and a lot less frustrating to design and write those quilt patterns if you know about this going into it as you're designing. A lot of the software is out there, Adobe Illustrator, EQ8, some of the things that a lot of people are using to design quilts will allow you to plop a block in to any size that you specify, right? No matter what dimensions you end up getting out of that block when you actually go to sew it. But those are a pain in the butt to try and sew with traditional piecing because you can't cut a lot of these pieces, right? We want to stick to those 1/4 inch increments. So if you're armed with this information going in as you're designing, it makes the process a lot easier. The worst thing is to design a quilt that you love. You've got everything sketched out. It looks beautiful. You've fallen in love with it, only to realize that it is going to be a pain in the butt to sew or impossible altogether, and you have to start over. That sucks, and it's a huge time sink. So keep this in mind if you're ever in that situation. Now you know. Hopefully this saves you a lot of heartbreak. Alrighty, that's all I've got for today. If you found this video helpful, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you back here next week for another Tech Tip Tuesday. See ya!